Candles burned low as the ballroom filled with laughter, and Alina Whitmore stood alone near a marble pillar, feeling every eye slide past her like she did not belong. She wore a simple gray gown, while the women around her glittered in silk and jewels. Duke Edmund Hartley crossed the room with 3 companions at his side, his eyes catching her plain appearance instantly. He leaned toward his friends and spoke in French, his voice smooth and cruel, mocking her dress and calling her a common girl who had wandered into a world far above her station. His friends laughed loudly, certain she could not understand a single word. Alina did not flinch. She set down her glass slowly, and the small sound of crystal touching marble seemed to cut through the noise around her. The Duke smiled, pleased with himself, expecting silence and shame from the vicar's daughter he had chosen to humiliate. But Alina lifted her chin and looked directly into his eyes. Her father, a scholar before he became a vicar, had taught her Latin verbs before she could properly walk, and French poetry before she turned 10. She had spent years buried in books while other girls learned only embroidery. Now, standing in a ballroom full of strangers, all that quiet study rose inside her like a flame refusing to be smothered. The Duke's smile began to fade as she opened her mouth to speak. The musicians in the corner had just finished a song, and for one strange moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the vicar's daughter would do next. Nearby, a young woman named Charlotte Ainsley gripped her fan tightly, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and even the servants near the walls paused their quiet duties to watch. Alina's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a fierce and sudden determination. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, dismissed as nothing more than a quiet girl from a small parish. Tonight, in front of London's most powerful families, she would not be dismissed again. The Duke's companions leaned closer, curious why their friend had suddenly stopped laughing. Something in Alina's expression had shifted the mood entirely, turning amusement into uncertainty. She took a single step forward, closing the distance between herself and the Duke, refusing to let his title intimidate her into silence. The candlelight flickered across her face, and for the first time that evening, she looked less like an outsider and more like someone who belonged exactly where she stood. The ballroom noise faded into a distant hum as the two of them faced each other, and everyone nearby sensed that the night was about to take a turn no one had expected. Alina answered him in flawless French, correcting the small grammatical error he had made without realizing it, and repeating his own cruel words back to him with a calm, steady voice. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized the vicar's daughter understood every insult he had spoken. The Duke's face went pale, but Alina was not finished. She switched smoothly into Italian, quoting a line about arrogance and pride from a poet her father adored, her pronunciation perfect and unhurried. A nobleman standing nearby, Henry Caldwell, nearly dropped his glass in shock, whispering to his companion that he had never seen anyone speak to the Duke this way. Alina then turned to Latin, delivering a final line with such precision that even the Duke's closest friends stared at him instead of her, waiting to see how he would respond. The Duke opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, he had nothing clever to say, no sharp remark to hide behind. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, broken only by the soft creak of someone shifting their weight on the polished floor. Charlotte Ainsley covered her mouth, stifling a laugh she could not fully control, while other guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure whether to be scandalized or delighted. Alina did not smile in triumph. She simply held his gaze, letting the weight of her words settle over him completely. She turned slightly, ready to walk away, when she noticed something unexpected in his expression, not anger, but something closer to disbelief mixed with reluctant admiration. The Duke straightened his coat, clearing his throat as though trying to recover his composure, but his usual confidence had clearly cracked. Word of the exchange spread through the ballroom within minutes, guests whispering behind fans and gloved hands, repeating what they had witnessed to anyone who had missed it. By the time the orchestra resumed playing, nearly everyone in the room knew the name Alina Whitmore. Some looked at her with newfound respect, while others eyed her warily, uncertain what to make of a woman who could humble a duke in 3 languages without raising her voice. Alina felt her hands trembling slightly as she finally stepped back, the adrenaline of the moment beginning to fade into something closer to disbelief at her own boldness. She had not planned any of it, only responded to cruelty with the truth she had been taught to value above all else. As she moved toward the edge of the room, seeking a quiet corner to steady herself, she felt eyes following her every step, some curious, some hostile, and one pair belonging to the Duke himself, unable to look away. 3 days later, a carriage bearing the Hartley family crest stopped outside the small vicarage where Alina lived with her father. She watched from the window as the Duke stepped down, his expression unreadable, and felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of anger and curiosity. She assumed he had come to demand an apology for embarrassing him in front of society, and she prepared herself to stand firm against whatever he might say. Instead, when her father welcomed him inside and left them briefly alone in the modest sitting room, the Duke surprised her by admitting, quietly and without his usual arrogance, that he had never been spoken to that way in his entire life. He confessed that her words had stayed with him, replaying in his mind long after the ball had ended. Alina crossed her arms, unwilling to soften too quickly, and reminded him that cruelty deserved honesty in return, not silence born from fear of his title. The Duke, to her surprise, did not argue. Instead, he asked her, with genuine curiosity rather than mockery, how a vicar's daughter had come to master 3 languages so completely. Alina explained her father's belief that knowledge should never be limited by gender or circumstance, and as she spoke, she noticed the Duke listening with real attention, something she had not expected from a man known for his dismissive nature. Their conversation stretched far longer than either of them intended, moving from languages to books, then to opinions about fairness and pride that neither had expected to share. Alina found herself matching his wit rather than avoiding it, surprised at how easily their minds seemed to spar and align at once. The Duke left that afternoon without the apology she had expected to demand, and without offering one either, yet something between them had shifted noticeably. Over the following weeks, he returned again, always with some small excuse, a book to lend, a question about a translation, though both of them understood these visits were about far more than literature. Charlotte Ainsley, now a frequent correspondent of Alina's, teased her gently in letters about the Duke's sudden interest in vicarage life. Alina dismissed the teasing outwardly, but privately she could not deny that her sharp opinions of him had begun to soften into something more complicated. She still remembered his cruelty from that first night, and she refused to forget it entirely. Yet she also recognized a version of him now that seemed willing to learn, to listen, and to be challenged rather than flattered. Their unlikely exchanges continued, drawing curious glances from neighbors who began to whisper about the Duke's frequent visits to the vicarage, unaware of how deeply those conversations were changing both of them. Word of the Duke's growing attachment to Alina eventually reached his aunt, Lady Margaret Hartley, a formidable woman who controlled much of the family's influence within society. She summoned him to her drawing room and made her disapproval unmistakably clear, reminding him that a duke did not court the daughter of a country vicar, regardless of how clever the girl might be. She warned that his reputation and the family's standing would suffer if he continued down this path, and she urged him instead toward Lady Frances Bellingham, a woman of proper rank who had long been considered a suitable match. The Duke, though usually unshaken by pressure, found himself torn between loyalty to his family's expectations and the undeniable pull he felt toward Alina. Meanwhile, Lady Frances, humiliated by the Duke's obvious disinterest, began spreading quiet rumors about Alina among the households of the aristocracy, suggesting that the vicar's daughter had used trickery and deception to entangle a man far above her station. These whispers spread quickly, twisting Alina's confident response at the ball into something scandalous rather than admirable. Invitations that once trickled in for Alina and her father suddenly stopped, and cold glances replaced the curious respect she had briefly earned. Alina, hearing the rumors through Charlotte, felt a familiar sting of injustice rising within her, the same feeling she had experienced the night the Duke first mocked her, only now the attack came from unseen hands rather than open insult. She considered withdrawing entirely, retreating back into the quiet, unnoticed life she had lived before the ball, believing it might be simpler to disappear from society's attention altogether. The Duke, learning of the rumors and their damaging effect on Alina's reputation, felt a surge of anger unlike anything he had experienced before, directed both at those spreading the lies and at his own hesitation in defending her sooner. He realized that his silence, born from fear of his family's disapproval, had allowed cruelty to take root against the very person who had once dared to challenge his arrogance so boldly. Lady Margaret pressed him further, insisting that ending his association with Alina immediately would resolve the growing scandal before it caused permanent damage. The Duke stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between protecting his family's rigid expectations or standing beside the woman who had shown him, without fear, exactly who he truly was beneath his title. As tension mounted and Alina prepared to withdraw from society entirely, the Duke made a decision that would either restore her reputation completely or destroy his own standing in the process. At the next grand gathering hosted by Lady Margaret herself, the Duke rose before the assembled guests and asked for a moment of their attention, silencing the room with the same command his presence always carried. He spoke first in French, deliberately echoing the very words he had once used to mock Alina, only this time he used them to admit his own arrogance and the shame he now felt for his earlier cruelty. Gasps spread through the crowd as they realized what he was doing, publicly revering the humiliation he had caused months before. He then addressed the rumors directly, stating firmly that Alina Whitmore had done nothing but respond to his disrespect with intelligence and honesty, qualities he claimed were rarer among the aristocracy than any title or fortune. Lady Frances, standing near the back of the room, felt every eye shift toward her as the Duke calmly explained that the rumors against Alina had originated from jealousy rather than truth. Lady Margaret's expression tightened, but she said nothing, recognizing that her nephew had chosen his path with a conviction she could not easily overturn in front of so many witnesses. Alina, who had been invited reluctantly and stood near the edge of the room expecting further humiliation, felt tears gather in her eyes as she listened to him defend her without hesitation or shame. The Duke turned to her directly, crossing the room despite the murmurs following his every step, and asked, in front of everyone, whether she would allow him the honor of courting her properly, without secrecy or apology for who she was. Alina, her voice steady despite the emotion rising within her, replied that she would, provided he understood she would never again stay silent in the face of unfairness, whether it came from strangers or from him. The Duke smiled, admitting that he would expect nothing less from her, and that her refusal to be silenced was precisely what had changed him. Charlotte Ainsley, watching from nearby, could not contain her delighted laughter, drawing amused glances from those around her who had followed the story from its very first scandalous night. Within weeks, their engagement was announced formally, and instead of scandal, the story that spread through society became one of respect, admiration, and quiet astonishment at how thoroughly the Duke had been transformed. Alina Whitmore, once dismissed as a plain country girl unworthy of notice, became known instead as the woman whose brilliance had humbled a duke and ultimately won his genuine devotion, proving that intelligence and courage could outshine any title London's aristocracy valued so highly.